Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We will take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 4. Let us read out the question together. What is your understanding of natural justice, how it is relevant to work of a civil servant? As usual, the question has two parts. In the first part, you have to explicate what is your understanding of natural justice, that is how you think it is, what it is and how it is conceived. And in the second part, you have to talk about how it is relevant to the work of a civil servant. As you can well understand here, that while the term used here is natural justice, its application goes beyond the judiciary and it actually applies to the administrative system too. Anyway, before we start introducing the answer, let us talk about a few important things. This concept of natural justice has relevance for general studies paper 2 also. But here you have to keep in mind that you are attempting a question on GS paper 4, a question that you might come across in GS paper 4 rather than GS paper 2. So your approach should be slightly different. In the GS paper 2, you are supposed to mention, for example, case laws, some of the judicial pronouncements, etc., which have been made by the higher judiciary, Supreme Court and other high courts. But in the paper 4, in the GS paper 4, rather than mentioning case law, you are supposed to talk about the concepts of morality, ethics, etc. So this is the fundamental difference between your approach for GS paper 2 and GS paper 4. Anyway, let us introduce our answer. We would straight away start with defining natural justice. Natural justice is a philosophy that says that the judicial and administrative processes must be fair, impartial, and rule bound. As you can again see here, the concept of of natural justice is relevant not only for the judicial process but also for the administrative process too. And it should subserve a justness of outcome, that the outcome should not be questioned, that the outcome itself is unjust. It's so unjust that it's again started becoming questioned. So the outcome of your actions should be just as far as possible. Now, the 3 or 4 principles, we are mentioning 3 here, but it's many principles are involved in natural justice. But the 3 most important principles cited as constituting natural justice are, you might recall some of these principles while we were talking about the preamble of India and the concept of justice there. There is chance that your teacher would have discussed the concept of natural justice too. And some of the maxims of natural justice, for an example, the maxim of Audi alteram partem or the maxim of nemo iudex causa sua that you have done in GS paper 2, you can actually work on those concepts in GS paper 4 here too. Anyway, the principles are, first is the principle of fair hearing, which we have just talked about. The Latin version of it is Audi alteram partem, which means that all the parties must be heard. To give you just one example, suppose you are taking disciplinary action against some person, for example your subordinate. You have to give him enough chance of expressing his view on the things which are being questioned from him. Then the second principle is no personal interest, that is nemo iudex or nemo judex causa sua. In English, it would mean none to judge his own case. For an example, you have to take a discussion in which some of the parties who are connected to you might benefit from it. In this case, the best recourse available to you would be to recuse yourself from this decision, because someday some people might raise his finger that you had this, even if remote interest in this decision, but you still went for it and you tried to influence it to the benefit of the person to whom you were connected. The third principle, often cited as a principle of natural justice, is the principle of proportionality. That is, the penalties as per the law and not excessive. This is again a principle very, very fundamental to natural justice. The fourth principle, or you could say the fourth concept that comes under natural justice, is the concept of reasonableness, which would mean equality as far as possible, and then non-arbitrariness, that your decisions should be something that can make sense. They should not be arbitrary. To explain these points, an observation often used to personify natural justice is: justice must not only be done but seen to being done as well. This hints at a process beyond reproach, that even the outside observer, they should not be able to, like, they should not critique the whole process. They should not criticize the whole process. Your decisions should be such as that most people would actually accept it. Natural justice is fundamental to the work of a civil servant. First, why? Because we work in a democratic system, and the democratic system has enshrined commitment to justice in the very preamble of the constitution that it has adopted, and the concept of equality, which is introduced in preamble as well as fundamental rights, etc. too. Now, as you can well understand that as a civil servant, you are agents and part of the democratic system. A civil servant must exhibit these values, the values of justice, the value of equality, which come under natural justice, as we have just discussed. So, how is natural justice relevant to the work of a civil servant? First, as you can well understand that these principles, the principles of natural justice, are deontologically sound. You might recall that this comes from Kantian ethics, that some things are so fundamental that they apply in most of the cases, with very few exceptions. The things which you might recall are called categorical imperatives. So here, imperatives like fairness, non-arbitrariness, and impartiality, these are actually imperatives, that these should be absolute. With few exceptions, these should be absolutely adhered to. Second is, it helps build public trust. You can well understand that if some civil servant would appear, if he were to be considered just, he were to be considered fair and impartial, there is likelihood that the people would have trust in him. The public would have trust in the person and the system also. It also prevents abuse of power. Coming to the second principle of natural justice, for example, someone were to start taking interest in something that has a direct connection to him, it would lead to abuse of power. So natural justice prevents this abuse of power. It promotes harmonious social relations too. To give you a real life example, suppose there is a likelihood, there is a chance that there would that a social conflict, a social disharmonious situation might emerge, and if a certain public servant, a certain civil servant were to be considered impartial, he were to be considered fair by both, or in fact all the parties involved, the parties are likely to be convinced by them and less likely to engage in violence, etc. Moreover, it helps him earn the respect of all the people, and it shields him from unwanted influences like political influences and the influences, outside influences, which always try to get benefit from your work. They try to tilt you to their interests actually. Now, explaining these points, first let us start with the Constitution itself, which is a fountainhead of moral guidance. The Constitution is the supreme moral guide, the first moral guide for a civil servant. Natural justice is expression of deontologically sound practices like fairness, non-arbitrariness, equality, etc. So again, it's ethical in itself actually. Then a reasonable, fair and impartial system earns public trust. This trust can serve as a reasonable, fair and impartial system earns public trust. This trust can serve as social capital for a civil servant in cases like conflict resolution, as we were just talking about. If you are considered fair and impartial, there are chances that all the parties of a particular conflict would have their trust in you. Then it also helps you, for an example, convince someone to change. Now, this is actually very fundamental to your day-to-day life actually, and it would always help you that if you are pressed by diverse interests, as is the case in the daily life of a civil servant, not always positive, and sometimes, and in fact most of the times, these interests are less likely to be positive. This, for example, political interests or someone who is connected with the higher ups, who is well connected with the system. A civil servant must appear fair and acting on reasonable lines, because someday he has to answer for his actions, so that the process is accepted by everyone. Because if you consider like less flexible, to be very frank, if you appear less flexible on these matters, in the ethical and moral matters, most people are likely to go by with your decisions, even those disagreeing. Now, this is a very important observation we are making here, that as a civil servant, your only shield here is dharma, your righteousness, adherence to rules. You might recall the concept of dharmo rakshati rakshita, as is all sometimes said, that it's only dharma, it's only righteousness that would be your ultimate defense. So, as a civil servant, you have to always keep it in your mind. This is how we sum up our answer for today. We would bring to you another question in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.